One of the most stressful things you can go through as a property owner is a boundary dispute with a neighbor. Things get emotional, they get tense, they get stressful, and they get expensive. I'm going to tell you a story about a boundary dispute I got involved in about a year ago. This story is important because it illustrates several of the mistakes you want to avoid if you're a property owner in a boundary dispute like this. And my intent in this video is not to be overly critical of people that find themselves in this situation, because I understand it's complex and it's emotional. But the point of the video is to educate people so they don't make the mistakes that this family made in this story that I'm going to tell you, because I don't like to see this happen. It's sad, and regrettably, there were two licensed land surveyors in this story that both failed in their professional duty, in my opinion, and created some serious harm. And so the family wasn't able to count on the licensed professionals like they should have been. And again, regrettably, as a land surveyor that does expert witness work, I see this happen way more than it should. The main thing I want you to take away from this video at the end is that not every land surveyor is qualified to be an expert witness in a boundary dispute, and you want to make sure that you hire the right person for that job. And most land surveyors are not qualified to do it. Let me tell you what happened a year ago. There was a family, good family, that we got to know them a little bit. They seemed like good people. It's husband and a wife. They moved kind of COVID-19 era. They moved from the Bay Area out to the Sierra Nevada foothills, which is a rural area here in California. They bought an older home on a few acres worth of land. Those types of properties are not uncommon in that area. And they basically stripped this home down to the studs, did a complete remodel, added some floor space. And as part of this remodel project, they needed to upgrade the electrical utility service. So they needed more electricity than was currently available at the site. So they talked to one of the neighbors, and the neighbor agreed to let him pull electrical power from one of the poles that was on the neighbor's property. And so they did that work, and they ran the utility line from the neighbor's pole over to their side of the fence, and then down their side of the fence over to the home that was being remodeled. They built a beautiful home. It was a significant investment. It was a couple years of their time, and tens of thousands of dollars that they put into this. And this is not an uncommon scenario. We've seen this happen quite a bit in the last 5 years. Families that relocate from a wealthy but expensive area in the California Bay Area or the Sacramento metro region. They move to a rural area, and they buy these properties and they do these remodels. Now, here's the critical detail that becomes important in the story. When they did all this work, when they did the extensive remodel and they added the floor space and they put in the new utility service, they did not get a boundary survey. So they didn't get a boundary survey when they bought the property, and they didn't get a boundary survey before they did all this work. Now, how did they get all that through the county planning department and building department without a survey? I don't have a good answer to that question. I think there was probably some failure at the local government level there. This is a property that had never been surveyed before, and the monuments weren't set. So there should have been they should have gotten a survey when they bought. Their real estate agent should have recommended that. And the county should have asked for a survey before they issued permits on all this construction. But that's not what happened. Okay, fast forward a little bit. There's some kind of tiff with the neighbor. The family gets in some kind of tiff with the neighbor. I don't remember what the details of the tiff were, but there was some kind of disagreement, and things devolved fairly quickly. And so it's at some point in that dispute, that tiff, the neighbor says, "Hey, your utility lines are on my property." And the family that eventually hired me was like, "What are you talking about? the utility line's 10 feet on our side of the fence. There's no way that's not possible. The neighbor hires a local survey company. They come out, they do a survey, they hop my client's fence and go in 20, 25 feet and set property corner monuments and tell both neighbors the fence isn't on the property line. The property line's 25 feet inside the fence. The utility line is over on the neighbor's property. And it's important to understand that when the surveyor did this, not only did they ignore fences on this parcel that had been in place for a very, very long time, which is always a red flag. You always want to be very careful when you do that as a land surveyor. So not only did they ignore those fences, but the way they did this survey, they threw long-standing 100-year-old fences for a half a mile each direction into confusion. So they did what the technical term for what they did, we call it, they clouded the title. So here's a neighborhood. These fences have been in place for 100 years. This local surveyor comes out. He determines a boundary, and he just throws all these fences into dispute, essentially. So a very dangerous situation, something you want to be really careful about as a boundary surveyor. So when we get hired by the neighbor, so the neighbor contacts me, we referred him to a land attorney that we work with. The land attorney said, yeah, we're going to need a survey. So we get hired to go in and do an initial survey, just kind of see what are we dealing with, right? Look at the neighbor survey, evaluate if it was done correctly, take a look at the fences, do a little bit of field work, see if we can figure out what's going on. Now, when I first looked at this, I just knew something didn't pass the smell test here, right? I was skeptical from the very beginning. I was like, it's very unusual to have a situation where all these long-standing fences that are 100 years old are just completely shifted off the property lines like this. I'm not saying it doesn't ever happen. It can happen in rare circumstances, but it's not common, and it always makes me very cautious. So I told the attorney, I said, something doesn't pass the smell test here. I need to look into this. So we went out, we did some field work, we looked at a bunch of records, and what we found out essentially is that the surveyor that did the survey for the neighbor made a very obvious error. So they basically used an incorrect procedure to reestablish the corner. And if the correct procedure was used, legally the correct procedure was used, all the fences fell within a foot or two of the property line, which in this rural area was excellent. So essentially the surveyor went in, applied the wrong legal principle, and created this huge problem that didn't need to exist. What was frustrating for me is I know this company, I've interacted with them before, and it's a situation where the father is in his 80s and has poor health, but he holds the license, and the son actually runs the business, so he's not licensed. So essentially, you've got a licensed surveyor, that's old with health problems, that isn't overseeing the work like he should be, like he's required to do under law, and you've got a son that's out running around doing these surveys that he's not qualified to do. He's not licensed. He's never met the requirements to be licensed, and he made an obvious mistake here. So this is unfortunate. Right? This is why we license surveyors to begin with, because there's the potential for this type of harm. So I go back to the attorney and I say, hey, a lot of in most boundary disputes, there's some gray area. There's not a lot of black and white. I said, I think this is one situation where we've got, the other surveyor obviously made a pretty huge error here. It's obvious. I think you've got a good case. I think you should fight this. And I don't normally say that. Normally I tell people they need to settle because there's enough uncertainty. This is just a case, one of the few cases in my 25-year career it was obvious that the surveyor had created this problem because of incompetence, essentially. So we got on a meeting with the surveyor, the other surveyor, and the other attorney, and I asked some questions. And what I was basically able to determine is not only did the surveyor apply the incorrect procedure, but I think it's possible that they may have fabricated some evidence, or not at least not been totally honest about some of the evidence that they they found in the field based on our field work coming in after them. And so I told the attorney, this is a bad deal. Like, this probably needs to go to trial. I think if you get this in front of a judge, I think you can win this case. Now, here's what happened. I told the attorney, in order to do this, in order to get you prepped for trial, I need to do some more work. When you go to trial in a situation like this, in a boundary dispute, your case has to be watertight. So I said, look, I need to do some more field work. There's some trees that I need to get. Wood cores of. We need to send those out to be, dated by a lab. I got to go dig through some of the old land records. I said, there's some more work. I need, I can't remember what our initial price was, several $1,000s. I said, I need another $15,000 or $20,000 to go do all this work, pay for the lab work, and just get exhibits prepped to give you the testimony that you need so that we can get ready to take this to trial. And so the attorney said, understand, know exactly what you need, get a proposal together, and we'll talk to the client about it. So I gave him a proposal to do that work, and the client called me back and said, hey, I'm in a situation here. I told him, work with the attorney, submit a claim against your title insurance, which they did. And the title insurance company said, yeah, we probably owe you. We owe you. We need to compensate you for this claim. And the client told me, we settled with the title company for $20,000. And I said, did you talk to the attorney about that? And the client said, no, we didn't talk to the attorney about that. And I said, you're in a really tough spot now. I said, you settled with the title company for $20,000, and I understand why they did it. They needed the money. I said, but you settled with the title company for $20,000. I said, you need 10 times that amount to get this through trial. It's probably a $200,000 trial. I said, I don't know what you're going to do now. And they said, well, can't you just do the rest of the work, basically for free? And I said, I can't do that. I'm sorry. I'm running a business. I do charity work. I do volunteer work, but I don't do it for people that own custom homes on 5 acres in the foothills. I'd go bankrupt if I ran that kind of model. I said, this is unfortunate, but you settled with your title company without talking to me, without talking to your attorney. Now you don't have enough money to take this through trial. And so what they did is they found another surveyor. And this was actually a licensed engineer that was able to pass the surveying exam. So he's a civil engineer that passed the surveying exam, which means he has the legal right to do surveys. Now, just because he has the legal right to do surveys doesn't mean he's qualified to do it, right? And you remember I told you in the beginning that most land surveyors aren't qualified to do this type of expert witness work. So the client called me and said, hey, I got somebody that said he could do this for a few $1,000s, finish this up. Do you mind, meeting with him and giving him a copy of the records you found? I said, no problem. It's a professional thing to do. I'll give him the records we obtained, and I'll have a phone call with him and give him a line out on where we, kind of what we did and where we think we're at. I said, but I think it's really important that your surveyor come to his own conclusions. I don't want to prejudice him. I don't want to bias him. He needs to form his own opinions. The client said, yep, understand that. Really appreciate you guys, working with us. I said, look, you're in a bad spot. I get it. Nobody wins in the situation. Like, I'll do what I can, within reason. So I met with so just to be clear here, I got fired by the client. It's okay. It happens sometimes. You get fired by the client. He hires the second surveyor. Seems like a nice guy. I meet with him, give him the records, give him a little bit of background. He's off and running. So about 3 months later, I get a phone call from the client. We close out the contract, send him a letter, wish him the best. Get a call from the client. He says, hey, I'm a little bit worried. He says, my new surveyor's been running around for a couple months, and he can't find the problem. You told me and the attorney, you explained to the attorney that there was an obvious error here. He can't find the error. Can you call him and tell him what the problem is? And I said, look, I just can't do that. I said, he needs to form his own opinion. He can't take my opinion to court. He needs to form his own opinion. I said, you fired me. This guy came in, told you he could do the job for a fraction of the price. You believed him. I'm not gonna fix this problem for this other surveyor now. Like, he got himself into this mess. He needs to be a big boy, and he needs to do the job he told you he was going to do. And the law firm that was representing the client, we've been working with them forever. And I called the attorney. He's like, yeah, I understand. He says, I told the client not to hire this other guy. They didn't listen. No hard feelings. About a week or two later, the surveyor calls me and says, I can't figure this out. I know there's an obvious error here. You told the attorney, but I can't figure out what it is. Can you just tell me what the problem is? Can I call you? Can I come by? I said, look, I just can't. I'm not going to do that. I was like, the client fired me. They hired you. I'm not doing charity work on this particular dispute. I said, we do charity work, but I don't do it in these kinds of situations. It's like, you made the client a commitment. You told him you were competent and capable of doing this. Like, you need to figure it out. So I found out later from the attorney that this case is probably not going to go well. They're probably going to have to settle. They're probably going to end up paying the neighbor damages for this utility line they put in. There's this whole rat's nest situation now with all these properties. The fences aren't on the property lines. Really unfortunate, right? So we have two surveyors here that failed in their professional duty, right? We have the first surveyor, the 85-year-old guy that can barely, get out of bed, who's letting his son run around and use his license as a rubber stamp. Right? They came in, did a survey, ignored fence lines that have been in for 100 years, potentially fabricated evidence, caused a whole rat's nest, hornet's nest situation. Got a second surveyor, comes in, undercuts my price, says he can deliver the goods, be an expert witness, get it figured out. The client pays him, wasted that money. They waste 6 months, waste that money on the additional fee. They're no closer to having their problem resolved. So what does this teach us besides the fact that, that my chosen profession can at times behave in despicable ways? What do you do if you're a property owner and you're in a boundary dispute like this? I think there's some lessons here. First of all, go back before there was even a dispute. Part of the problem was somebody decided to remodel a home and build additions and install utilities. They didn't have a boundary survey. They didn't know where the property lines were at. That was a risky move. People do it all the time. A lot of times it doesn't cause problems. In this case, it did. This is one of those cases where it was a really bad decision. So get a survey, right, before you do that. The other problem was the client settled with their title insurance company for a fraction of what they needed to get the issue resolved. Don't do that. Talk to your attorney. Talk to your land surveyor before you sign a settlement offer with the title company. The title company got out of this thing way easier than they deserve to, in my opinion, right? And I don't blame the title company. They did what was financially in their interest, right? But it definitely wasn't in the client's interest. So don't settle with the title company unless you know that settlement is going to be enough to get your issue resolved. The other thing is when you're involved in a boundary dispute like this and there's already a lawsuit on the table. When I got hired, there was already a lawsuit on the table. You can't be cheap. You can't just hire the cheapest surveyor you can find. You need to be very careful about who you hire as an expert witness in that situation. And this doesn't just apply to your boundary surveyor. It applies to all the other experts you might hire as part of a legal dispute like this. So if you're a real estate investor or a land developer or just a real estate manager for like a college or a hospital, and you get into a situation like this where there's a dispute with a neighbor, what I want you to remember: hire a good land attorney. Hire a good boundary surveyor that understands the law and knows what it means to be an expert witness. Do not negotiate with your title company without those two professionals at the table with you, right? And understand that you need quality expertise to get through this. You do not want to go cheap on your consulting team when you're in a boundary dispute like this that has serious consequences, right? You want to spend the money. Okay? And remember, not all surveyors are equal. Most land surveyors have no business being an expert witness in a boundary survey and land title dispute. And certainly engineers that manage to pass the licensing exam to be a surveyor probably aren't qualified. They don't have the background or the experience. Right? I'm not saying there aren't exceptions to the rule, but there are exceptions. You have to be very careful. Right? I wish we lived in a world where licensed land surveyors could be honest about their qualifications, but unfortunately we don't. We don't live in that kind of world. And so you, as the client or the potential client, have to exercise appropriate caution, right? The consequences are severe in a dispute like this. Hire somebody that can demonstrate to you that they have the capabilities to get this type of work done, right? And then don't make critical decisions like the amount of money you're going to get from your land title insurance company until you've talked to those consultants.